But I'm thrilled that we have two, really, of America's leading experts on U.S. foreign policy. If I listed all their accomplishments, we would have no time to have any part of this meeting because they have careers that are quite extraordinary. Dean Allison, of course, we all know, was the founder of the Kennedy School of Government and the original dean, I guess. And Ambassador Blackwill was, in addition to being one of our ambassadors to India, was Deputy National Security Counsel and then have had Deputy National Security Advisor. And they've had many, many other honors and positions. But again, as I said, we won't go through all of them today. We're going to talk about this book, which I had the pleasure of returning from Cambodia yesterday. So I got to fly from Siem Reap to Phnom Penh to Hong Kong, where I figured, okay, I would certainly have time to read the entire book during that. This looks like a pretty short book during that, 5 hours of travel. But in fact, I didn't finish it because really every section of this book requires kind of reevaluating the way you think about U.S.-China relations, the way you think about the United States, the way you think about India, the way you think about the world. It really is, it's a remarkable kind of accumulation of the wisdom of Lee Kuan Yew. So it took me actually till I got back to Beijing and almost back to New York till I'd actually had finished the entire book. But it's absolutely worth reading. It is for sale. Judging by the number of people here, we may run out of copies, but it is for sale. So I urge you to buy early. Or as we would say if we were in Chicago, buy early, buy often. But, they're going to just each speak for, I think, 10 minutes. Then I will ask some questions. I've got dozens and dozens of questions I want to ask, but I'm going to let the audience carry the burden or the benefit of being able to ask questions. So I think, Graham, you're going to go first, but let me turn it over to you. And thank you for being here, and thank you for writing or putting down all these wonderful, compiling these wonderful insights from this fascinating person who I'm sure we all don't agree with, but we're always interested to hear what he has to say.
So thank you very much, and thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for hosting us and for Jones Day. So I'm going to do just kind of television time, 3 threes, okay? So 1, why should you care what Lee Kuan Yew thinks? 2, what does Lee Kuan Yew think about the future of China? And 3, what does Lee Kuan Yew think about the future of Chinese-U.S. relations? So under each of those, I'm going to give you 3, and these are just to suggest that they're morsels from a feast, and the feast is prepared by Lee Kuan Yew, and Bob and I were I don't know, maybe we upset the table or served the plate. So first, why should you care what Lee Kuan Yew thinks? Number 1, Lee Kuan Yew is the world's premier China watcher. There's no one who has watched China longer, more astutely, more intensely, in a more informed fashion, and come to judgments about the country. Actually, he's been watching China all his life. He's actually Chinese Singaporese. Every Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping has called Lee Kuan Yew and engaged Lee Kuan Yew, asking him questions, but in which he spent literally hundreds of hours with all of the leaders of China. And he's an astute observer. Secondly, if you ask what individual outside of China's leadership has had the greatest impact on China's development in the last generation, the answer again is unambiguously Lee Kuan Yew. As Ezra Vogel's magnificent biography of Deng Xiaoping makes plain, when Deng Xiaoping was considering China's march to the market, he looked around and said, well, who could I talk to about this? The answer was Lee Kuan Yew. When he wanted to understand how this works, he came to look at Singapore and cross-examined Lee Kuan Yew at length about how this worked in Singapore. So this is an individual who has had the biggest impact of people outside China's leadership on what's actually happened in China. Thirdly, Lee Kuan Yew was the founder of Singapore and its prime minister from 1959 to 1990. When he became the prime minister of Singapore, Singapore was a poor, corrupt port in which the per capita income was less than the poorest African countries in 1959. When he stepped down in 1990, Singapore was a first world country. And today, 6 million people live in Singapore and have a per capita income higher than that of Americans. So why should you care what Lee Kuan Yew thinks? There's 3 reasons. Secondly, what does Lee Kuan Yew think about the future of China? Well, the answer is quite a lot. And what we do in this book is ask Lee Kuan Yew questions, and the answers are his answers from hours of conversation with him over the last couple of years, informed by whatever he had said and written previously, which we had reviewed. So we ask what we think are the questions most international people would be most interested in. And he has a capacity of being very explicit, very direct, very succinct in offering answers. For example, point 1, are China's current leaders serious about displacing the U.S. as the predominant power in Asia in the foreseeable future? You can read many tomes of professors and pundits and not find an answer to this question. Okay? On the one hand, on the other hand, around this corner, around that corner, Lee Kuan Yew. Of course. Why not? Who could imagine otherwise? How could they not aspire to be number one in Asia and in time the world? This reawakened sense of destiny is an overpowering force. So, secondly, is this going to succeed? Will they succeed? He says, well, there's no guarantees. The chances of it going wrong in China are about 1 in 5. I wouldn't say 0 because there are problems with weighty ones, systemic change, business culture change, reducing corruption, forming new mindsets, but 1 in 5. So 80%, he thinks the answer is going to be yes. Okay? When China becomes number one, how will it behave? What will be the consequences for its neighbors and the rest of Asia? So Lee Kuan Yew says, listen, unlike other countries like Japan or Germany, China wants to be accepted as China, not as an honorary member of the West. And what might that mean? Well, he says, we live in the neighborhood. Quote, they expect us to be more respectful of China as China becomes more influential and more powerful. They tell us that all countries, big or small, are equal. We are not a hegemon. But when we do something they do not like, they say, you have made 1.3 billion people unhappy. So please know your place. So he sees nothing out of the ordinary in China's punishment of the Philippines. That's led to a 40% decline in Philippine electronic exports, their number one export to China in the past year, as there's a dispute in the South China Sea, or in the significant decline in Japanese-Chinese trade. Again, part of the same picture. So that's what about the future of China, and a lot more. What about the future of U.S.-China relations? Well, again, more complicated. First, will there be a serious competition between China and the U.S.? Lee Kuan Yew, yes. The 21st century will be a contest for supremacy in the Pacific. Secondly, will there be a military conflict between the U.S. and China in the foreseeable future? No. Quote, in the security area, the Chinese understand that the U.S. has spent so much more and has built up such an advantage that a direct challenge would be futile. Not until China has overtaken the U.S. in the development and application of technology can they envisage confronting the U.S. Militarily. But will this emergence of China upset the global balance? And the balance of power in Asia and the global balance of power. And Lee Kuan Yew says, if I find my page here, yes, of course. I'm sorry, if I quote it, if I say my words, you'll see how poor they are in comparison to his. In any case, what he says is, yes, this will be that never before in history has a state of this size and proportion emerged so rapidly, and so that this will be a challenge not simply to the Asian balance of power or to the balance of power that the U.S. has been maintaining in Asia, but to the global balance of power, and that nobody has figured out how to live with such a transformation. So that's 3 threes. Why to care what he thinks? What about the future of China? And what about the future of U.S.-China relations?
Thank you, Steve. And again, I join Graham in expressing our appreciation for having us. Let me begin just as Graham ended, because while he was thumbing, I was able to find the quote I think that he was looking for. And there are 2 conceptual points I want to make at the beginning. This is one of them. And again, this is Lee Kuan Yew speaking, quote, "The size of China's displacement of the world balance is such that the world must find a new balance in 30 to 40 years. It is not possible to pretend that this is just another big player. This is the biggest player in the history of the world." Now, since all of us analogize in order to try to understand the current circumstances, what he's saying conceptually is beware of analogies, because this has never, ever confronted the international system before. And so if you're like Graham and me, you try to find historical analogies, and you know what they are, the Athens, Sparta, or Germany at the end of the 19th century and so forth. And Lee Kuan Yew warns us against historical analogies because of the weight of China in the international system in the next decades. So that's point one. Second, conceptually, Graham mentioned it, but I want to just say a few more words about it. The balance of power. You may recall that in one of her very first speeches as Secretary of State at the Brookings Institution, Hillary Clinton questioned whether the balance of power was an appropriate concept to apply to current Asia, and thought it wasn't. I think her views evolved over time on that score. Lee Kuan Yew is a classic 19th century European balance of power person. And you recall that in the 19th century, especially the second half of the 19th century, but the Napoleonic period too, believing in the balance of power had no opprobrium attached to it. It was a series of ideas about how nations in their natural state reacted with one another. And it did not depend on moral judgments, except among the Russian czars from time to time, about the organization and implementation of the balance of power. What Lee Kuan Yew says is that the balance of power is the best optic through which to look at Asia writ large over the foreseeable future, and that in that concept, the United States' role in Asia is absolutely indispensable, because only the United States can balance the rise of Chinese power. He goes on to say that China has no concept civilizationally of partnership. And there are many sinologists here in the room who understand his view, which is that the Middle Kingdom had a certain paradigmatic view of looking at the world, with, of course, China at the center and then others paying homage. Know your place, as Graham said earlier. And that, and again, Lee Kuan Yew makes no moral judgment about this. He just says that's China. And therefore, he says, don't expect China to exhibit self-restraint and act itself to balance its own power. He might say any more than you would expect the United States to do that, by the way. And therefore, he says, the U.S. Balancing role in Asia for this century is indispensable. And just to say a word about this, there's a chapter on the United States, and Lee Kuan Yew believes that the persistent, even fashionable talk about America in decline is rubbish, as he says. And perhaps just to finish this, the wish is the father of the thought, because if the United States were in systemic decline, then of course it could not play that balancing role in Asia over the long term, which Lee Kuan Yew believes is so important. Finally, let me say that perhaps we spent these hours with him, which was a great privilege, and he was, as you'll see, and Steve has seen on the airplane, extraordinarily candid in what he had to say to us. I and Graham and I have reviewed everything he's ever said that's in the public domain. He's never been as candid as he is in this book, ever. And whether it's because he's approaching his 90th birthday or whatever, but it was, there are no, and Steve said this in another way, there are no commonplace ideas in this book. Those of you who follow U.S.-China relations are getting ready to read what you've read many times before. You won't read it in this book, or about Russia, or about India, or about the international system. But I found most interesting, and I'll conclude with this and skip a bunch of what I was going to say. The last chapter is how does Lee Kuan Yew think? If he is arguably, perhaps along with Henry Kissinger, the most preeminent, distinguished strategist in the world, how does he think? How did he get to be that way? And when he gets a new problem, how does he think? So we really pressed him on this, and his first response, I don't know how I think, and who cares anyway? But we pressed him and pressed him and pressed him, and we got, and let me just finish with some of the things he said about how he thinks. My upbringing in a 3-generation family made me an unconscious Confucianist. It seeps into you, the Confucianist belief, that society works best where every man aims to be a gentleman. The underlying philosophy is that for a society to work well, you must have the interests of the mass of the people, that society takes priority over the interests of the individual. This is the primary difference with the American principle, the primary rights of the individual. I am a liberal in the classic sense of that word, in that I am not fixed on a particular theory of the world or of society. By the way, needless to say, he has no ideology, so there's clearly no place for him in Washington. He is an unapologetic Hobbesian. Here's what he has to say. Human beings, and can you imagine any Western politician saying what he's... Human beings, regrettable though it may be, are inherently vicious and have to be restrained from their viciousness. We may have conquered space, but we have not learned to conquer our own primeval instincts and emotions that were necessary for our survival in the Stone Age, not in the Space Age. I have always thought that humanity was animal-like, while Confucius' theory says that it can be improved. I am not sure it can be, but it can be trained. It can be disciplined. You can make a left-hander right with his or her right hand, but you cannot really change his or her natural-born instinct. I want to say he's a great listener. I worked for George Shultz, had the privilege once of working for George Shultz, who once said, my presence, he said, listening is an underrated way of acquiring knowledge. And Lee Kuan Yew is a great listener, and one of the problems Graham and I had was we'd fly all the way to Singapore, and then he would want to ask us questions, and we kept trying to deflect him. I'm going to finish with these last 2 points. We argue, what is the biggest life experience you had which affected the way, your worldview, the way you see the world? Here's what he said. He said, I never thought that the Japanese could conquer Singapore and push the British out. They did and brutalized us, including me. I was 18 and a half when that happened. On my way to Oxford, I learned about power, back to 19th century concepts of the balance of power. I learned about power long before Mao Zedong wrote that power came from the barrel of the gun. The Japanese taught me this in Singapore in the 1940s. The Japanese invasion of Singapore was the single biggest political education of my life, because for 3.5 years I saw the meaning of power and how power and politics went together, and I also understood how people trapped in a power situation responded because they had to live. And then finally, at the very end, we asked, how do you wish to be remembered? And he said, well, first, let me start. First of all, we asked, who do you admire and why? He's met everybody for the last half century. His answer was De Gaulle, Deng Xiaoping, and Winston Churchill. De Gaulle because he had tremendous guts. Deng was a great man because he changed China from a broken-back state. And Churchill because any other person would have given up. And then, how did he wish to be remembered? Quote, I do not wish to be remembered as a statesman. First of all, I do not classify myself as a statesman. I put myself down as determined, consistent, and persistent. I set out to do something, and I keep on chasing it until it succeeds. That is all. Anyone who thinks he is a statesman needs to see a psychiatrist. Thank you, Chairman.
I think 2 terrific presentations, which gives you a flavor for how much fun this book really is to read, that so many passages are so interesting and actually so controversial. Let me start with 2 not really substantive questions, then get on to the substance, which is, I've got 2 great experts on both sides here. I could say political sides too. But why did you do this jointly?
Well, the short answer is that we are colleagues. We taught a course together. We're friends, and we both admired Lee Kuan Yew. And so it seemed, it was kind of a strange idea when we first started doing it, but it actually, I I think if either one of us had been doing it alone, we wouldn't have got him to feel as comfortable. So it was fun.
It was Graham's idea, and I was delighted to come along. We both had known him for a long time before and had seen him many times. And we found over the decades that we're smarter when we work together than not. I graded all the papers for 14 years in our foreign policy course at Harvard that we taught.
It's the division of labor.
Thousands of them. No, I really didn't grade them all. It seemed like it from at some point. But I think Graham is right that he knew us both, but not as a couple, if I may put it like that. And so we came to him in different ways through different routes. And he was, I think Graham would agree, he was quite relaxed with us. There was a trust, and I think I'm not revealing more than I should when I say that we taped our conversations with him and then sent the transcripts to him to be sure that we had it right and that there was nothing in it, in what he had to say to us, that he'd had second thoughts about. He never changed a word in looking at those transcripts. No editing whatsoever, and I think this comes out in the book.
How's the book done?
It's been, well, for 1 week it jumped to the top, I don't know, 50 in the Amazon list. It's been on the number one bestseller in Asia for many weeks, right, and in Singapore. And it's had a reasonable circulation in the U.S., not as much yet as I would wish. And I think a place that also where I think it's not found its niche yet is for people in the financial and investment world, where, I mean, if I were thinking about China or India or Asia or macro hedges, I mean, my Lord, if you had a guy like Lee Kuan Yew to give you his guidance to what's going on, you should pay him some huge amount of money, and you get it for $12 in a book. So, but in any case, I think we're happy with the book. We could have made it 800 pages long. We decided to make it nice and slim, where you can basically read any chapter. But I think what you said is right, Steve. So you're like our ideal reader, that if you read the answer to the question, you look and you say, whoa, he can't say that. And you think, well, he can say whatever he wants. That's what he says. And you think, well, let me think about it. And you often may not agree, but I think in every instance you've got a new set of coordinates that you at least have to grapple with, because these are not casual views of somebody who doesn't matter. These are views of somebody who's extremely well informed and who may know more about China than I know, so maybe I better rethink my own views. Yeah.
And just to add one thing, it is, I think, approaching 30, we've sold 30,000 copies of it, which in this domain is a bestseller. And of course, Graham and I don't fool ourselves, it's because of what Lee Kuan Yew has to say. There is an edition coming out in China of the book, another one in Mongolia, another one in Vietnam. So out there, people are finding it worth reading. And it's been excerpted in China already. Maybe I can just say what he says about Xi Jinping is that he's tough. He's not, he's come through a tough life, cultural revolution, and he's not, like his immediate predecessor, a careerist, if I may say that. One could find a variety of words, but that he's lived a tougher life. He is a man of steel, the recently chosen president of China. So, but again, Xi Jinping calls Lee Kuan Yew my mentor, and that's been true of every Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping.
I think among the blurbs on the book is from Xi Jinping, which says, quote, "Our senior leader who has our respect."
Put on your following. I know you're using his words, but put on your foreign policy hat. And before I get to where I disagree with the senior minister or the senior mentor, ask you, where do you disagree with him most in the China section or the U.S.-China relations section?
Good question. I don't count myself a serious scholar of China. I'm extremely interested in China. I'm interested in American foreign policy and national security, so one can't help take account of this juggernaut or this phenomenon. So I've read Henry's book, and I've read whatever 100 books on China, but as a person who doesn't speak Mandarin, doesn't really have much feel for the context. I find him everywhere insightful and provocative, and actually, if I compare him with other people who were coordinates for me, so I would say Kevin Rudd, who's been the Prime Minister to Australia, I would say is quite insightful about China in the recent period, or Stape Roy,
Right.
who's now at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He seems to me to be extremely thoughtful. Henry, obviously, of course, Kissinger. I think Lee Kuan Yew, maybe in part because he sees things from the inside out, because he actually is ethnically Chinese, but he is first, second, and third Singaporeans. So his identity is as the guardian of Singapore, and I think he sees more into the dynamics in China than most anybody.
Bob?
I think the one thing that I was extremely surprised by, if you ask him, when he does the weaknesses of China, he's got a better. I have a kind of accounts that I keep on U.S. short or long, China short or long, for countries. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? Well, in China, he comes up with several that I never have heard of any person ever. Maybe there's some others, but that I had never heard of anybody else identifying. So, what are the problems for China? Well, he's got a whole long list of them, but here, maybe there's somewhere else. He says, they got a problem with the language, Chinese. He says Chinese like a prison, a language that shapes the thinking through epigrams and 4,000 years of text that suggests everything worth saying has already been said, and said better by some earlier writer. So when you answer a question, you try to think which one of these things applies. So as he says, he tried to persuade one of the Chinese leaders that they should switch and make English the first language. He said this was not well received, okay? But in Singapore, they made English the first language. So his kind of analogy is the difference between a kind of an open system and a closed system. And I'd say, whoa, who's going to imagine somebody saying to a Chinese leader, no, you could just change your language.
I think it's a terrific question, and it made me wonder, well, what did I think about these subjects before I started talking to it? Because he certainly has affected deeply the way I think, and I'm in the same category as I am, of being very interested in China, but not a China scholar. I would say two things. I hope he's right about America. I'm not a declinist, but his view of the balance of power in Asia is so dependent on American renewal and vitality that one can't help wonder whether that colors his confidence in American renewal and vitality. Something that didn't make it in the book, and many things didn't make it in the book because we were determined not to go on and on and on, was I asked him after he was eloquent, as you'll see, on American strengths and sense of reinvention. I said, well, what would shake your confidence that once again the United States will reinvent itself? And his answer was, well, and this was before our last presidential election, the answer was, well, if your next president, Obama or Romney, goes through his entire term without seriously addressing the debt problem, I'll begin perhaps to wonder. Well, for those of you who read the Washington Press, perhaps he'll be wondering. The other question I'd ask, and again, there are many people in the room who'd have a more informed view of this. Lee Kuan Yew categorizes civilizations and people in simple terms. And he does it, because he does it, he produces enormous clarity and allows us to capture some of that in a book no bigger than that one. But on the issue of, which Graham mentioned, of Chinese, the civilizational effect of Chinese on invention, in which he goes on to say, notice the Chinese basically don't invent anything. And he contrasts it with the United States' sense of invention. I wonder if that really is an overreach about this China. And it's sweeping. It's enormously, it is a very big idea because he says the people of China will not be able to transcend this box they're in of this 4,000 years of ideograms and so forth. Well, I just wonder if it's true because you have generational changes in China. China is out in the world, as many people in this room know better than I do. I really wonder, he said at one point, where are the Bill Gateses in China? Well, maybe they're 14 years old now, or they're 26, or they're something or other. So it's not so much that I think he's necessarily wrong. I'm pretty not known widely for having much humility, but you think that's an understatement. But I'm pretty humble in finding things to disagree with him about, but I just wonder, and we'll be able to see there's something of a laboratory experiment as China frees itself to, in many crucial ways, and our chairman here could speak much more eloquently than I about this, whether we'll find this sense of invention and creativity if the state gets its strong hand off those dimensions of human existence. But I would say one last thing. I shouldn't say this because U.S. Ambassador to India, I have to say this or I won't get back to New Delhi. He's absolutely lacerating on India. And he says basically it's not a real country. And it's rather...
When he said that, yeah. The ambassador almost fell off of his chair.
Yeah, right. Well, anyway, and it's unrequited affection and hope. He's known all those leaders since Nehru. And he had great hopes for India, and he has been disappointed. He says it's a mistake, as many people do, to use India and China as nouns in the same sentence, because you will be misled. And he wants India to play a balancing role in Asia regarding the rise of Chinese power, but his hopes are forlorn that will happen, and he regrets that. I think India is a subject I know better than China, and I think it's certainly true that many of the things he criticizes in India are worth criticizing. He may go too far in saying India is not a real country, But that's another example. But with respect to China and U.S.-China relations and the balance of power, there's nothing I disagree with in terms of the great strategic thoughts he has about the rise of Chinese power and the United States' role in Asia and so on. It's not a word I disagree with. He's a Kissingerian. I mean, he and Henry have been friends, as we know, for much of their adult lives. And they are now maybe the two incandescent strategic realists on the face of the planet. A group that's diminishing in number every year, sadly, as ideology infects our view of foreign policy. But he is classic Metternichian 19th century strategist. Can I say just one more thing? He is arguably the inventor of geoeconomics as a notion of international interaction in the current era. And by that, I would define it as the use of economic tools for geopolitical purposes. Not for economic purposes, but for geopolitical purposes. And he believes that China is, as we've discussed before, Steve and I, a very skillful user of geoeconomics, which the United States is not, but it's just another example of how fecund his mind is as he looks. So the balance of power is what I want to say. The balance of power in the 19th century was on the battlefield. In the 19th century, Napoleon was defeated on the battlefield. In the Cold War, the balance of power was partly ideological around the globe. Many places, as a Soviet official once said to me, notice we're struggling over places where neither one of us would ever want to take our families on vacation. But what Lee Kuan Yew says now is the big economic dimension of the balance of power. Richard Haas's new book, which I commend to you, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, about the United States, captures the same idea. And I think Lee Kuan Yew is arguably the first person inside or outside academia who has identified this big new economic component of the balance of power, and one that I think our own government, if you're an American, hasn't yet digested.
So when in the book you ask the right question, when you ask about this whole being number one, and this is where I disagree with the senior mentor. You ask the right question, which is, are Chinese leaders serious about displacing the United States as the number one power in Asia, in the world? Then the answer is actually grouped together without really distinguishing the two. You ask two separate questions, but the answer is really one, even though there's a whole argument that the near seas, the far seas, the Chinese conceptualize this quite differently. And he says the Chinese think about being number one. Well, I've read lots of what the Chinese leaders say, and I've talked to a lot of Chinese leaders, and what's missing from his answer is I don't really think they think a lot about being number one. They think a lot about staying in power. They think about staying in power, and the things that he attributes to their desire to be number one really are driven by the need to stay in power. Like any political party, you do what's necessary to retain power. And that's a lot of what it's about. And so that's where I find this answer kind of, well, of course, why not? That's a little flip. Do they want to be number one? Of course, why not? Well, the answer is when you're confronted with these environmental problems, these social problems, the population problems, the rich-poor problems, you name it, the minority problems. These are so overwhelming that what you worry about as the leader is dealing with this. And that actually, if that then has implications for what U.S. policy should be towards China. If they're thinking about number one and displacing America, that's different than if they're thinking about retaining power and doing what's necessary to retain power. And there's certain different policy prescriptions. So I don't know how you think.
Let me agree and disagree. So I would say, I mean, if I'm doing this in my class, just in general, I say, what do political leaders care about first? All political leaders. Survival.
Right.
Hanging under the tiger.
You got it.
So this is called the primacy of domestic politics. Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local politics. The answer is absolutely. And in international politics, people that study international politics mainly want to talk about international politics. But if you look at what Obama does, or what Cameron does, or what Merkel does, or what Xi Jinping does, I would say think first about their domestic politics, and boy, do you have a lot of clues. Okay, that's number one. So that point I agree completely. Secondly, for the Chinese leaders, the syllogism goes, how do you legitimize the Communist Party, which is no longer communist, but the Leninist mandarins who run the country, and how do they maintain their legitimacy? The answer is, we deliver to you super fast growth, you let us drive the bus. That's it. Okay? And that's been a great deal. And I would say, actually, if they went around and offered this to most people in most other countries, you would get a lot of people signing up for such a leadership. You deliver to me double-digit growth, I think you probably get a majority of Americans say, well, why don't you try it for a decade and let's see how it feels. Okay? So they do that, and therefore they need, what are all the conditions required for that? And Lee Kuan Yew says, and I think this would be considered general conventional wisdom, they need a benign environment.
Right.
That's why they don't want to have any confrontation, because they need a benign environment, understanding they need trade, they need sea lanes, so that's a good reason, again, for not confronting the U.S. until you're stronger. Okay? Secondly, though, if and as that becomes less, or as economic growth slows a bit, which is even you can see some evidence of, and if it should slow more, what's their next best hope? How about nationalism? Okay? And is there rising nationalism? And are Chinese proud that somehow a broken back country is now seeming like a normal country? I would say everybody whom I know who deals with any Chinese think yes. And I would say, is this very normal historically? Yes, this seems quite reasonable. So the idea that for normal Chinese today, and I would say this is for the mayor of any city in China that I've seen, you say to them, are you prouder to be Chinese today than you were 10 years ago or 20 years ago? You bet. And do you think that because China is stronger, it should have more say and sway in the world? They say, yeah. And when Xi talks about the China dream, you're talking about, China kind of coming back to its rightful place, a little bit more respected. So you go to international meetings of ASEAN or other, Chinese are thinking they should be moving up at the table, up a little higher at the table, a little bit better hotel, a little bit better. So I would say, yes, that looks quite normal to me. So I think the Lee Kuan Yew's proposition that then they, as they begin to look at this, they think, well, should the Americans be the arbiter of Scarborough Shoals? We have a dispute with the Philippines about some territory, and the Americans should tell us how this should be adjudicated? Well, why? I mean, we live here. We're a big country. Why? So I think this seems to me almost of a piece. I mean, Kevin Rood, who was visiting us recently, had just been there talking around the circle. This is this Australian former foreign minister, and he said, one of the guys who's quite part of the new regime, very high-level guy, said to him, we're just tired of being pushed around by the Philippines. Okay, and there I got it.
Let me open the floor to questions. Start over here.
Yeah.
Please identify yourself and speak very loudly.
Sure. I would posit that.
And identify yourself.
Sure. Mark Fulton at Good Barnett Partners. We do consulting work, advisory work, taking people into China and India. I would posit what Lee Kuan Yew is saying as a Confucian, you have to look at the Middle Kingdom, how the Middle Kingdom views itself in the world.
Louder.
And so if the Middle Kingdom views itself in the world in a certain way, and through that prism, we look at the role of China, and it's not just the power of staying in power, it's about what the Middle Kingdom should be. If you look at it that way, Lee Kuan Yew makes a lot of sense.
Can I just chime in and say, I take it as a fact that none of us know what the Chinese leadership says to each other about the issue that we're now discussing. That is to say, do they intend to be number one in Asia and then the world? And we are unlikely to know what they say to one another. But it seems to me that that's not a crucial question to have answered for American policymakers. And there's probably a debate inside China anyway about that, with some being more robust and ambitious on that score than others, some having different timelines than others. But what is, I think, indisputable is that the growth and application of Chinese power in Asia is changing the balance. That's indisputable. Yep. And the challenge for American foreign policy is to find applications of its power and influence to balance that. The Chinese tend to think that that's called containment. I don't believe that's the apt concept to apply to what I'm describing. Lee Kuan Yew, since he's met all these people, spent hundreds of hours with the Chinese leadership, thinks he knows what they want. And I don't think to conclude that it's necessarily contra to what you were saying at the outset, Steve. They do want to stay in power, but he thinks civilizationally, Lee Kuan Yew believes civilizationally, they find it an unnatural historic period that for the last half century, the United States has called the shots in Asia. They think that's unnatural. And that China, civilizationally, has a much better claim than the United States, on the basis of geography, if nothing else, to be the most important power in Asia, to replace the United States. But as I say, there's probably a debate about this. It needs to be said that on that, and it doesn't appear in that same passage, but appears later, Graham adverted to this earlier, Lee Kuan Yew believes, though, whether they think that or not, that even if they do, they have a very long timeline. A very long timeline. Half a century. And that's his view for a variety of reasons, which he goes into in the book. So again, can the United States, and I, of course, having the professional experience I've had, keep asking myself, can the United States have a coherent policy over many administrations from both sides of the aisle to deal with the rise of Chinese power? And I think that's an enormous challenge for us as a country, because he believes that this will increasingly, as China gets more powerful, make it awkward, if not unpleasant, for the United States because we're so unused to this. He basically gives the Americans the advice, get used to the rise of Chinese power. Don't get hostile to it, but get used to it and deal with it, and don't expect the Chinese, through self-restraint, to solve your problem for you.
He says the U.S. has yet to settle on a bipartisan policy on China since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Do you guys think that's right?
Well, This is an interesting one, and it's a good point. And Kissinger has a view that says the great accomplishment of American foreign policy in the period actually
Since 72.
Since 72 has been a bipartisan policy that's been continued. I kind of think Lee Kuan Yew has the better side of this argument. I think that initially there was a great footing for U.S.-Chinese relations in the period after 72, which was we shared a common enemy, which we both feared and cared more about than we cared about our differences. After that enemy collapsed, post-91, I'd say that even though we've sort of stayed on autopilot, the grounds or foundations for it have been less clear.
We're going to need to, because I promised we would end on time. Can I just ask one final question? Did you ask him at all about his opposition to the split from Malaysia, which struck me as one of the. It was so fundamental in the beginning of Singapore that when the Singapore-Malaysian Federation was established, he opposed the split of Singapore from Malaysia. He really wanted to.
And he discusses
and that was such a it's such a fascinating. That he is obviously the success of it for Singapore is almost beyond comprehension, and so early in your career to make a political judgment that was so fundamentally flawed, and now to be this absolute, icon of.
He describes this in his autobiography. From the third world to the first world in one generation, which is like 1,500 pages, and I cannot remember. I apologize. How he gave us the explanation.
His explanation is that he hoped the union with Malaysia would give protection against the growing communist influence inside Singapore. That was his basic thing. But we didn't. Of course,
it was history. Yeah.
Well, is there? Can I just say? Always, when you do a project like this, you then finish with it, and it's now in press. Well, what do you wish you'd asked him? And so I will take up on it. And I can't believe we didn't ask him this, but we didn't. Which is the more bellicose Chinese policy. With respect to the East and South China Seas, beginning whenever you would pick it, 2007 or whenever you do, is something of a mystery to people who follow China, and there's lots of debate about why is it, and we didn't have the wit, although we spent lots and lots of time, Graham and I, thinking about the questions we wanted to ask him. That seems like, at least to me, such an obvious one that we didn't ask. So and I would be fascinated what his explanation of this somewhat more bellicose Chinese policy, since so much is written about it in the West now, trying to understand whether it's strength of the PLA or bureaucratic infighting or the road to the presidency or whatever it is. But we didn't ask him that.
Well, I hope this discussion is.
So you ask him the next time you see him. Ask him that
That's
question.
right. I hope this discussion has given you a taste of what a wonderful book that this is. But thank you both for writing the book and being with us today.
Thank you.